Hello and welcome to my Best Games of a Letter Arcade Edition. The idea is I choose 5 games of a letter for, in this case, arcade games, imagining all others would disappear. So I'm not coming at my list from those that are most historically important or even seen the best by the majority of people, but rather what games today do I enjoy the most personally. I then, of course, will give loads of honourable mentions of all the arcade games that you probably would have chosen, and games that I think should be mentioned being some hidden gems. Of course, it's all a bit of daft fun and really an excuse for me to flag some fun arcade games to you and, maybe fuel your nostalgia of games you'd played in the past and perhaps forgotten, or highlight new ones that may have passed you by. It's all about the next time you're staring at a fully loaded emulator box of choice or going through your countless retro collections, it may help in giving you ideas of games to play and try. So sit back and enjoy as I take you through the last big letter of the alphabet with the letter T. Now don't forget though, in the video comments there's a playlist to all the other letters of the video that I've done for the alphabet so far. So if you're watching this on my Drisk YouTube channel, please also note there is the RGDS podcast channel, which is a new YouTube channel that I've set up on the back of our RGDS podcast that we do, which is a free audio podcast typically, although we started to do video versions of the podcast. It's early days, not many people have found it, and a lot of it, probably only 1% of our listeners have given it a go, with most understandably preferring the audio because they can get on with other jobs, but it's there if you want. And if you like what you see here, there's loads more content, and future content will be on the RGDS podcast channel, so please consider subscribing to the RGDS podcast YouTube channel. We'll appreciate it. Right, anyway, let's go on to the letter T, and it's a tough letter to choose from, with many games in this letter there's so many to choose from. It's such a big letter with so many classics and interesting games. I've gone through them all pretty much, all the ones I could get my hands on, and I'm pretty happy ultimately of the top 5 lists that I've chosen and the many honourable mentions. So let's go on to my number 5 choice. Now for my 5th choice, I've decided on Time Crisis, released in December 1995 by Namco. This has you play Richard Miller, a spy operative who must rescue the president's daughter. It's a really cool light gun shooter, this, with a cool mechanic of having a foot pedal that can be used to duck into cover and reload. It works fantastically well, really drawing you into the action, and it's really surprising to me that other light gun shooters didn't adopt this. Of course, in many ways, my 5th choice is for all of the Time Crisis games, and in a lot of ways, to be honest, Time Crisis 2 is actually my favourite. But if I'm honest, my PS2 was in storage. I couldn't emulate it as I thought I perhaps could. But Time Crisis 1 was so revolutionary, maybe it's right that was my choice to take, with only the sequels sort of upping the variety of the levels and things that you would go through. So I'm pleased ultimately this is my number 5 choice. Now for my number 4 choice, and I've chosen the nostalgic choice here with Konami's 1989 beat-em-up Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or as we knew it in the UK, Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, as bizarrely the UK government decided the word ninja was bad and would corrupt its youth, even though it happily let us in the UK have kids shows like Captain Pugwash, who had characters like Seaman Staines and Master Bates. But I digress. On to the game itself, and it's based on the cool animated TV show, lesser on the darker original comics. And that was no bad thing. I mean, it was such a big deal in the late 80s of Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. And we, as kids, all wanted to be either Donatello, Michelangelo, Leonardo, or Raphael. These turtles that could do ninja moves. They live in sewers and eat pizza. Sewer pizza. Yum. And they fought crime and was trained by a rat, as you would. It was a weird time, the 80s, what can I say? Anyway, Konami did an amazing job bringing this cartoon to life, with perfect representations of all the enemies and characters in the show. And it really made you feel like you were in the TV show itself playing through. And as a kid, this was huge. I can't express what a massive title this was. We all seeked out to play it whenever we could. It had particularly the fabled 4-player version where 4 kids or players could line up and play each of the turtles simultaneously. And you know, for the longest time the arcade version was the only way to play it, with the home ports being completely different. Eventually home ports did make their way, but yeah, they struggled with the hardware that they were on. So even like the Amiga was pretty disappointing, really. Now, I mean, going back to this game today, sure, it's repetitive, it's mindless, it's a real coin muncher. I mean, it will swallow your coins. But it brings back so many warm, nostalgic, fuzzy feels for me that I just had to have it in my top 5. Even if it's for that little kid that was me that used to dream of winning this arcade cabinet as a kid, phoning or thinking about phoning that premium rate number that used to always be on the back of adverts in the back of video game magazines back in the day. Now, the game did see home ports, as I mentioned, but they weren't that good, struggling with the hardware. Yeah, really, we had to wait until the Xbox 360 era before we could get an arcade perfect port in the home officially. Now, thankfully today you can officially get this and its sequel with the Turtles Cowabunga collection. Now, this is on all the modern consoles, and it's not only has a sequel in the arcade, but pretty much all the Turtle home ports as well in the 8-bit and 16-bit eras. It's a fab collection and well worthy picking up. Now, of course, MAME also has this perfectly emulated, as you see here. And yes, you've guessed it, Arcade Club in Bury, near Manchester in the UK, has the 4-player arcade cabinet on free play, along with its arcade sequel, actually. So it's awesome. It's awesome to be able to play it as it was intended with 3 other mates. Right, let's go on to my third choice, and I've chosen the 1989 arcade game Toki, or Juju Densetsu, translated to Legend of Juju, as it was known in Japan. Now, this is made by the TAD Corporation, and Toki is a platform game close to my heart, as it had some amazing home ports, particularly the Amiga one, which I played to death as a kid, so that's really where my nostalgic feels come from. Now, it started life as a series of sketches by a freelance artist that had come along to look for a job. And when he showed the portfolio of his work, the TAD president fell in love with a particular sketch, this funny monkey, and so they built the whole game around this initial sketch character. Now, the game has a weird, strange art style. It's quite dark in places. It's not cutesy as you'd normally expect from platform games, and I guess it's in keeping with the weirdness of a fire-spitting monkey. I guess it's all of this that I just really, really enjoy, and you know, I always seek out and try to play this wherever I can. Now, as I mentioned, a series of home ports were made on various platforms, the Amiga and Atari ST being the most faithful to the arcade original. The Mega Drive version is interesting, actually, as it's completely different levels to the arcade. So in many ways it's kind of like the sequel we never got to see. Anyway, either version well worthy of a play. Now, today Toki has been remastered in 2019 by Microids, and it's on most modern platforms, often going for pennies, really, usually like 89p. And this is a really nice update. It's faithful to the level design of the arcade, but it replaces the sprites with hand-drawn visuals and a totally remastered and awesome soundtrack to the game. It really is a nice re-release, and you know, on sale it'd be foolhardy not to pick it up. I just wish they gave you the original game as well. I think it's just a shame. As good as the fantastic artwork is, you can't beat some of the original sprite artwork for nostalgia. But you can play it on MAME, as you're seeing here, or yes, it's another one that's in Arcade Club in Bury, so that's a great way of playing. Of course, the one in Berry is on normal difficulty setting, so expect to have your ass handed to you a lot and die continually. This is a game that definitely plays better on easy. Now, sadly, this was Tad's last game, with the planned overhead puzzle platformer Toki being cancelled on the Super Famicom, despite being nearly complete. Now, the source code was actually reused and released by another firm who bought the source code, and they called it Little Magic on the Super Famicom. So if you wanted to see this weird platformer sequel that would have been to Toki, you still can. Now on to my second choice, and for this game I've decided for Konami's 1982 gem, Time Pilot. Now this is an overhead shooter. Taking out the craft around you is eventually you destroy so many you'll get to see a bigger craft, kind of like an end level boss if you like, but less grand, just taking more hits really. And once you destroy them, it all goes wobbly with the time travel and you jump to the next time period. It's addictive as hell, and I love the fact that, starting in these different time periods with you going to 1910, so it's sort of like going into World War One, and you have biplanes that you're up against. Then you go to 1940, and of course it's sort of World War Two planes. Then it's the 1970 era, and you're in helicopters, I guess, in the Vietnam War era. And then finally it's on to present day of 1982 and jet planes in the Cold War. And then the final level is into the future, the far-flung future of 2001, and you're up against UFOs, because of course that's what it was going to be in 2001. Now famously, this is one of the principal reasons Epic designer Yoshiki Okamoto got pushed out of Konami, or fired, depending on how you look at it. Now, he'd originally been tasked, you see, to create a racing game, but the idea bored him. He wasn't interested in doing that, so he secretly did this shooter game instead, showing false design documents to his team manager to throw them off the scent that he was actually working on a totally different game. Now, when he finally sort of showed what he'd been working on, it naturally caused a lot of frustration and anger with his team manager, and there was a big argument with credit and money for the game, which resulted in some say he got fired, some saying he jumped before he was pushed. But either way, don't feel too sorry for Yoshiki Okamoto, because of course he went on to Capcom, after doing 2 strong games of Gyruss and Time Pilot at Konami. He went on to Capcom and, he did Gunsmoke, Sidearms, Final Fight, and Street Fighter 2, to name but a few. He's even a producer on the Resident Evil game, so he certainly has had a long and illustrious career and a large part of Capcom's success. But back to Time Pilot, and if I'll be honest, for years I was pretty indifferent to this game, with it never seeing a home computer port outside the MSX and only console ports on the 2600 and ColecoVision, which had passed me by. So when home ports on the 360 finally sort of came, or obviously the fantastic emulation of MAME, I just always skipped over it because I didn't have the affinity with the game. But one year in one of our RGDS podcast meetups in Arcade Club, our listeners voted for this to be one of the games we would do a score challenge over. We always choose a number of games to have a fun score challenge over. And it actually got me playing the game and appreciating the game's skill and addictive charms that, fast elevated it to one of my favourite games. I never tire of it. It's addictive, it's quick blast, and it's a lot of fun. And now, today you can play it on the Switch and PS4 as part of the Arcade Archives series. Frustrating, the Arcade Archives. Why don't you release on Xbox as well? It's frustrating. But you can, of course, play it on MAME, as I'm showing here, which emulates it perfectly. Right, okay, now on to my favourite game, beginning with the letter T for the arcades, anyway. And yes, it could only be Tempest. Now, released by Atari in 1981 and made by David Thurer, hot of his success of Missile Command. This is an epic vector-based 3D wireframe blaster, full colour, looks gorgeous. That has you shoot down a tunnel at monsters clambering to the top. Now, using a spinner control to the game, it truly is immersive with the glow of the vector colour graphics and fast, frantic gameplay really drawing you in. Now, along with your trusty blaster, you also have a limited super zapper weapon which can clear all the enemies off at a single point, which is great when you get yourself stuck in a bind. The game started off as a 3D Space Invader game, but despite the nice vector graphics, Dave noted that the other Atari employees, which was always the yardstick when developing, would try the game, say nice things about it, but not come back. He realised it needed more focus, and so, fueled by a nightmare he allegedly had of monsters coming out a well attacking him, he decided to place these 3D alien ships, instead of being like Space Invaders, onto a tube shape. This immediately gave the game more speed and focus, and along with the spinner, really drew you in. And you know, even through development, he knew he had a hit on his hand, with Tempest truly being born. Now, for me, this game is arcade perfection. It really is one of my favourite arcade games of all time. Any letter, if I'm honest. Certainly in the top 5. And I just never tire, you see, of its mesmerising full-on action. So much so, I actually bought the rather overpriced, if I'm honest, Arcade 1-Up Couchcade. This is like a sort of arcade stick and spinner and trackball that you can put on your lap. And it has many of my favourite arcade games of all time. Tempest, Centipede, Crystal Castles, to name but a few. And, you know, to be able to play it on a true spinner in the home is awesome. But outside of that, the Atari 50, the Anniversary Celebration Collection by Digital Eclipse, which is on all modern consoles, features Tempest, along with Tempest 2000 as well, the fantastic Jeff Minter sequel on the Atari Jaguar. All the ports here are fantastically represented with all the history. This is such an important, wonderful retro collection. Even if you have like a main box or things like that, I think the Atari 50 Anniversary Collection is still worth picking up. It does a great recreation of vector graphics. But as you can see here, MAME does, you know, particularly on a gaming PC like mine, does a great, wonderful representation of vector graphics and plays really well. Now, likewise, there's many other ways to enjoy the game, but you know, I've various other packs in the past that you can pick up of Tempest. But of course, you can never beat the real arcade vector arcade machine, and thankfully Arcade Club in Bury actually has a number of a couple of these Tempest game arcade machines, which I can't thank enough, because they are pretty difficult to maintain, so it's wonderful that they have them and keep these wonderful machines going. Okay, so that was my personal top 5 games for the letter T. Please, you know, reach out, give me your top 5 games that you would have chosen in the comments of the video. I'd love to hear, genuinely, what ones you would have chosen. Now, as you probably realise, there's some big hitters and some other amazing games that I've left off the list, and I, obviously in the usual fashion, I think I thought I would actually list out some of these games as honourable mentions, and there's a lot because it's a big letter. So starting with the Sega big arcade classics that didn't make my list, and the first, of course, we have Turbo Outrun, released in 1989. Now, this is a huge change to the 1986 original game, with grittier, more realistic, sombre graphics, and you really do miss Yu Suzuki being part of the sequel. His magic is definitely gone from the sequel. This time you're racing across America from east to west, going through many key cities, starting in New York and ending in Los Angeles. It's got some nice ideas, like your girlfriend changing into the rival car if you finish certain sections not first, which, you know, really sort of shows what a cow she is. But as I mentioned, despite all these nice gems and little germs of ideas, you do miss that magic of Yu Suzuki. You know, it's got Satoshi Mifune, who was programmer and designer on quite a few of these many Sega games. I mean, he's no slouch and part of Yu Suzuki's team, but you know, I think he's a better programmer than designer, if I'm honest. Now this does things differently. There's no multiple choice tracks, so you can't choose different tracks to go down. The F40 car has a turbo this time, so you can go faster, which is nice, I guess. But it's all hampered by the game designs. The car feels too big for the road. There's too many twists and turns, meaning every time that you decide to use your turbo, chances are you're going to end up crashing into a lamppost or one of the many obstacles on the side. So it just frustrates more than entertains. And I think that's why it's a less loved sequel, and most people don't have the same affinity with it over its original. And it's a shame, because I would love to have seen what Yu Suzuki would have done, because there's some great germs of an idea and he could have made it into something really special. Now, sadly, the game home ports were unable to capture the advanced arcade game, and I think Sega's pretty ashamed of this game, because it's never ever been re-released in an arcade perfect port, whereas Outrun has a number of times. Now, thankfully, MAME now emulates the game perfectly. For the longest time it didn't, and so it's still playable today, thankfully, and still enjoyable to play. Now, another Sega arcade game that for me I'm not too much a fan of, but is definitely worthy of a mention, is 1987's game, release game of Thunderblade. Now, this takes inspiration from the 1983 film with the helicopter Blue Thunder. In fact, that digitised film from the title screen of the game is actually from that film, which I find hilarious. Gone were the days of copyright, I guess. They were less worried about it in 1980s. Now, what is the game if you don't know? It's a weird hybrid of overhead shooting sections, which I actually quite like, and sprite scaling as you fly through the levels. In many ways, plays like a slower, less fun-paced game of Afterburner. Now, the game had a number of home ports, and they all struggle to capture the quite advanced sprite scaling in the game. Now, thankfully, years later, 3DS machine did have a nice port, and as you can see, MAME runs it perfectly today, which is probably the best way to play it in today's world. Now, another huge game I expect made many of your top 5 game lists was Konami's 1983 game Track and Field, originally known as Hyper Olympic. Now, it allowed up to 4 players to take turns to do 6 Olympic events. So you got your 100-metre dash, the long jump, javelin, hurdles, hammer throw and high jump. Now, these are all controlled by 3 buttons. 2 buttons to bash really hard to do speed, and then an action button to, release the javelin or jump or whatever you need to do. Undeniably, this is a fun, addictive game, and as a multiplayer, it's a real joy. Every time we go to Arcade Club, there's usually a couple of our listeners will sort of sit round one of these arcade machines and see who comes out on top. My trouble is I'm always been rubbish at it. I'm never good at getting through, and it's so brutal, so easy to fail the qualifier and not even see all the events. So that's probably why I didn't make my own personal top 5 list, my ineptitude. But I totally take it on the chin. This is an amazing, amazing game, and I wouldn't be surprised that it's on many of your lists, and for all the good reasons. Now, another popular game, undoubtedly making some of your top 5 lists, I know Kingy's top 5 list probably, would be Tron, the arcade game. Now released in 1982 by Bally Midway, it has you play 4 mini-games from, set around the Disney film of the same name. Now these can be done in any, well, the first 3 can be done in any order, and then you get to the core final 4th section. Now the best mini-game is Light Cycles. This is the famous one that everybody knows, where you're riding a light bike and you can block in your enemies, causing them to crash. It's been aped many times by public domain games and etc. for good reasons. It's a really good mini-game to have. But if I'm honest, this is the only mini-game that I enjoy. The others are I.O. Tower, where you blast the bugs and get into the core. And there's a tank maze where you must destroy the other tanks and succeed on the level. To me, they're all pretty naff outside of the Light Cycle one. Once you've beaten those 3 games, though, you're on to the final section called the MCP Core, where you must blast the regenerating, beautifully coloured blocks and make your way, pushing your way through to the core itself. And that's it. 1 iconic mini-game and 3, for me, naff ones. But the cabinet is undeniably gorgeous, and, it's just my personal opinion. I know many, including fellow co-host of RGDS podcast, Kingy, absolutely adores this game, and he's always trying to convince me of why it's so good whenever we go to Arcade Club. I'm happy to be proven wrong. Tell me in the notes what I'm missing about this game. Now, another game that was huge back in the day was Terminator 2 Judgment Day by Midway, and released in 1991. Now, Midway in the 1980s had really pushed both the technical achievements and boundaries of taste with their games, introducing digital sprites and gore with games like Narc or the all-out gore of Smash TV. But with Terminator 2, they really showed how well digitised graphics could be utilised in their games, really showing the film as a game. Now, James Cameron, the director of Terminator 1 and 2, when he saw their initial demo that they'd sent, he was blown away about how advanced gaming was. So he gave the instructions, to give the team whatever they needed to make this game happen. Now, of course, they were still unable to pay for the likes of Arnold Schwarzenegger in the game, but they instead used his stunt double wearing prosthetics to give him the same look in the game, and they used the twin sister of Linda Hamilton to do her sections of the games, which worked fantastically well. I mean, you wouldn't know unless I'd told you. I hope I haven't ruined it for anybody, that they weren't the real actors. But they did manage to get Bob Gunton, reprising his role of T-1000 in the game, which is awesome. And, they were able to get the look and feel of the locations in the game. Now, looking at the game today, it's repetitive with levels that are too long and outstay their welcome. But for the time, it was a striking revelation to see such digitised representation in true video game, as opposed to a limited Laserdisc game that we were used to before. So, I think it's definitely worthy of an honourable mention. Now, one game well known due to its home ports is, of course, Tubin, released in 1988 by Atari, and having 2 totally tubular dudes racing on their floating rubber tyres to reach the end, avoiding a stack of obstacles. Now, extra score is given for going through the gates or hurling picked up rubbish and hurling it at your opponents, and that's what the game does. It's got an interesting control styles. There's basically 4 buttons that you press, so there's bottom left and bottom right to go forwards with your movements. So if you press them both at the same time, you'll go straight, otherwise you'll go turn left and right forward. And likewise with back, the two buttons. So there's quite a surprisingly good control mechanism with the game, and this is a nice, enjoyable two-player game. I think it really elevates itself when you're playing it with a mate as opposed to against a computer. You know, instead of playing it against the computer. Now it's made by Milt Loper. He also designed 320 Degrees. And, you know, this one's appeared on, it's in Arcade Club, but it's also in the Midway Arcade Treasures 1 pack on the PS2 and Xbox and GameCube era, and also on the PS1 Arcade Party Pack. So there's ways historically on playing it, or you can play it through MAME as you're seeing here. Now, another great title worth mentioning is Truxton, or Tatsujin. In Japan, that means master. Now, it was released in 1988 by Taito, and Midway did the US release. And it was developed by Toplin. It was a Toplin shooter. And it's a brilliant, rock-hard vertical blaster. I mean, Masahiro Yuji took ideas from his previous games of Tiger Heli, Slap Fight, Twin Cobra, taking many of those ideas of the games, but taking it forward with the technology of the later game. And it is an awesome game. The reason it didn't make my top 5 is personally I find it far too difficult. It's got stupid difficulty spikes right at the beginning as well, which really annoys me and is a real coin guzzler. But if you're less of a wimp than me, I mean, you'll love this. And to note, the Mega Drive home port I think is a lot fairer balance and probably the nicer way to play the game. One thing to note, the Japanese version is a lot more difficult than the Western release, so if you are mad and you want a real challenge, play the Japanese version. Now actually it's the sequel is the one that I much prefer, being Truxton 2 or Tatsujin O, that's OH, and that translates to Master Ruler. Now this was released in 1992 and it's more the same in many ways, but it's got better graphics, more balanced gameplay and a fantastic music score. I love the tunes in the game. Now most people don't ever talk about the sequel because it passed most of them by. I mean, it only had the FM Towns Marty home release and it ever made it to Mega Drive and other machines. But, you know, give this game a go. I think it's a beautiful, wonderful game. It needs to be played more. Now, another well-known game is, of course, Tapper, released in 1983 by Bally Midway. Now, it had wonderful, for the time and even now, detailed full-colour cartoon sprites and was chock full of humour. And the game, you play a bartender and you pull your beer and you slide the beer to the patrons that are coming gambling towards you to get their pint. If they reach the end of the bar, you lose life. If you throw an extra pint that they don't pick up and it smashes, you lose a life. There's so many ways of dying here. And that's probably the problem I have with this game, is it stresses me out. There's just too much going on. You've got to worry about picking up the things. You've got to run down, perhaps pick up tips. And I just get confused. It's one of those games where you've got to rub your tummy and pat your head, and I'm useless at those sort of games. But I do admire what this game can be for those that are more skilled and gifted than me. A classic example is Tracy did a RGDS podcast YouTube video where she showed herself playing it through, and my word, you know, when you see her playing it, a skilled player, it really shows you, one, how rubbish I am, but also why this is such a classic. So, you know, definitely one to give a try. It is on the Midway Arcade Treasures pack. And also, actually, Antstream does have this one as well, which is nice. Now finally, for the big hitters, one has to mention Tekken and its sequels, of course. So starting with Tekken 1, released in by Namco in 1994. It was by Seiichi Ishii, who'd worked previously for Sega on Virtua Fighter and Virtua Racing. So, I mean, this really would have been a slap to the face for him to work with Namco doing basically a competition, a sort of, a game going up against Virtua Fighter. And, he's done an amazing job here. It's a really solid fighter, great lineup of characters, and there's a really good move set here. Now, of course, such a successful game would see many sequels, with Tekken 2 in 1995, and probably my favourite, Tekken 3, released in 1997. Now, since then, there's been many sequels, each improving the visuals and gameplay, and it's easy to understand why it's so popular today. But those are the games that I didn't choose of the popular titles that failed to make my own top 5 list for the letter T. But of course, there's oodles more of lesser known and hidden gems worthy of your time. So let's start with the fighting genres. I'll do these games loosely grouped by genre. So with fighting games, there is of course Tatsunoko versus Capcom Ultimate All-Stars. Now this is a criminally forgotten Capcom fighter featuring the Tatsunoko anime studios behind such classics as Battle of the Planets cartoon. And they're up against a roster of Capcom video game characters. Now released in 2008, it fries my brain that Capcom only ever released this in the home on the Wii of all things. And it is a great port, but you can't help, it was locked away by most people by not having, how many people had a decent GameCube controller or a Wii Pro controller. Your average person wouldn't have that. So it's a real shame, and sadly it's a game that the Dolphin emulator still struggles with, certainly on my computer at least. So this is one, it doesn't emulate in the arcades that fast, so really the only way to play it is to dust off your Wii and find the game, which is a real shame. I really hope that Capcom considers re-releasing this game, but I guess it's difficult with the licensing of Tatsunoko. Now another Capcom fighter worthy of your time is of course Tech Romancer, or Chukao Senki Kikawa, meaning apparently Super Steel Knights, Kikawa in Japan, in Japanese. And this 1998 beat-em fighter has you basically take on controls of two giant mech robots. So, giant mech robots fighting each other. It's designed by Soji Kawamori, and he would go on to do the first two Armored Core games on the PlayStation as well. I think Tech Romancer is a wonderful fighter. Just controlling large robots is awesome, but it's good character design and addictive gameplay. Now, other games to mention is, of course, the puzzle games, and of course the rather popular series of Tetris games, which I was quite surprised the number of Tetris games would be that were made for the arcade, because it's not a game that you would necessarily think for the arcades. Now, of course, there was Tetris by Atari, released in 1988 by Ed Logg, he of Asteroids and Gauntlet fame. Now, he'd seen the Atari ST version running, and he was so enamoured with it that he pushed Atari to do an arcade adaptation with him at the helm. And that's what they did, and they licensed it famously back into the home computers of the Atari version under the name Tengen. Now, this famously caused ire when the Russian delegation were told by Nintendo that this had happened, and they famously, Atari, along with other companies, had to pull their copies of Tetris for the home computers. So only 100,000 were ever sold of the Tengen Arcade home copies, making them quite collectible today. This is a really solid, if uninspired version of the game. It doesn't know anything new or exciting, but it's a very solid and one that you often think of when you think of Tetris gameplay. Now in 1988, also that same year, Sega released their own arcade Tetris, also thinking they had licensed it successfully, which they had for the arcade. Now this was a huge hit in Japan, with its focus on endless, ever faster play, really gelling with people in the arcades. But for me, it was the 1996 Jaleco arcade game Tetris Plus that I really, really like. Now, it was developed by Bulletproof Software, and this took the idea of adding a whole puzzle element to the game. So the idea is that there's a little explorer character known as the Professor, who's exploring like the tombs, and you must make pre-arranged blocks disappear to help him get to the bottom and get to the next level. All the while there is a trap ceiling with spikes coming down ready to crush him, and of course he seems to have no sense of danger, so he seems to climb up to the highest point of whatever you have on the list. It's really, really enjoyable and well worthy of your time. Had a great Sega Saturn port and PS1. It was popular enough at least to have a sequel with Tetris Plus 2 in 1997. It's really more of the same, but yeah, that's no bad thing really. Well worthy of your time as well. Now we come to the next Tetris series, which of course is the Tetris Grandmaster series, released in 1998 by Capcom and developed by Arika. Now the game really focuses on that Sega idea of going continually faster all the time, but they take it to another level, going faster with every single block dropped, so it gets fast pretty quick with it ramping up to those speeds. And this makes it much more suited to arcades, with shorter goes and pushing towards burst gameplay and high scores. So I can see why this was so popular. Now a sequel would follow in 2000 with Tetris The Absolute, the Grandmaster 2. And this added a master mode, offering more difficulty to the main version. And finally there was Tetris The Grandmaster 3, Terror Instinct, released in 2005. This was the last Tetris game in the series in the arcades. There was another one which was exclusively on the 360, but this iteration makes it even tougher and adds classic rules and world rules, because at that time, the people who owned the Tetris company that was selling these licenses, they insisted on honouring the rules that they had set. Now on to platform games for a change, and let's look at, there's so many worth mentioning, but let's look at Teddy Boy Blues, Yoko Ishino, released in 1985 by Sega. So this was inspired by the 80s pop song by Yoko Ishino, and she featured heavily in the advertising, with being a debut song that had done so fantastically well for her. But what do you have gameplay wise? It's nothing to do with her or the song really. It's a fun, frantic platform shooter where you take out endless range of bizarre enemies. The game had a fantastic port on the Master System, and that's probably where most people remember playing them. Now an interesting and bizarre one is the Galaco Thunderhoop, released in 1992, as you look to defeat Dr. Jen Brain. It did a kind of sequel in 1994 as well called TH Strikes Back, which is a run and gunner shooter. But yeah, it's a bit of fun, but it can't. It does feel like it deserves to be more on the home on an Amiga or something, as opposed to the polished levels of an arcade game. Now, Atari, meanwhile, brought us Thunder Jaws, released in 1994, and has you play a James Bond-like secret agent as you swim against mechanical killer sharks and enemy henchmen, and then on the base do walking sections, very much like Rolling Thunder. It's a fun James Bond themed game, even though it's not officially licensed, and well worthy of your time. Now, for fans of the game Tapper, you may also like Ballet Midway's Timber game, released in 1984, also done by the same designer. You play a lumberjack, yes, he's okay, and you take on the bears, bees and birds as you fell those trees. It's got fantastic graphical art style of Tapper. As I said, it's made by that same designer of Steve Mayer. But I quite like this. It's a lot of fun running around chopping the trees. It gets really difficult very quickly, but it's a lot of fun. Midway Arcade Treasures 2 compilation on the Xbox and PS2 era and GameCube does have this game. Now, one game that I think well worthy of your time is Namco's 1994 game Tinkle Pit. This is a fun 1 or 2 player game. It's a maze game, so it's kind of mixing in Pac-Man, but with Bubble, if that explains it. It's got gorgeous graphics, as you're seeing here, and it's really nice that it includes a lot of the Namco game enemies from other games, making cameo appearances. I think it's a wonderful title and a real hidden gem. Needs to be played by more, with it never seeing up home ports outside of the arcades, which is a real shame. Now, talking of hidden gems and moving to other genres, there's Thunder and Lightning, released in 1990 by Seta. This is a really nice bat and ball game with a nice sense of progression as you go through the levels. Now, it did see a home port on the Famicom, but only in Japan, so this is a title that passed many people by, and well worthy playing it today. But let's look on to other genres, and let's look to the beat 'em up genre for the letter T, and there's some amazingly great ones here. And let's start with one of the best, with Tenchi wo Kurao 2. I won't even bother doing the subtitle, but basically it's Dynasty Wars 2, and probably a lot of people didn't know there was a Dynasty Wars 2. Now, it was released in 1992 by Capcom, and it's also known as Warriors of Fate in the US and Europe. That's probably how most of us knew it. Or it's also known as Sango Kushi 2 in Asia, so lots of names you might know this under. Now, I always loved the idea of the Dynasty Warrior games, and this has great graphics, very typical of 1992 Capcom, and it's addictive as hell to play. It did see home ports of the PS1 and Saturn, but only in Japan, and so, you know, I think for a lot of listeners and watchers of the video, you may have missed that there was a sequel to Dynasty Warriors, so enjoy. Now, another one that was big in the home ports is, of course, Tiger Road by Capcom, and released in 1987. Known also as Torohe no Michi in Japan, meaning Road to the Tiger as well, so you may know it as the Japanese original name. Now, this is a frantic left to right slash 'em up. It's had loads of good home ports, as I mentioned. It's also on the Capcom Arcade Classic Volume 2 pack on the Xbox and PS2 era. And it's another one that Arcade Club in Bury has, which is awesome. But actually, Trojan I probably prefer even more than Tiger Road. This is another Capcom game released in 1986, so the year before. And in similar ways, it's got similar graphics or gameplay to Ghosts and Goblins. Now, it's also called Tatakai no Banka in Japan, and it did appear in the Capcom Classic Collection Volume 1 and the Capcom Arcade Cabinet collections that came on the 360 PS3 era. So there's plenty of ways of playing Trojan. It's a really, really fun game to play. Now finally for beat-em-ups, there's the brilliant Thunder Fox, released in 1990 by Taito, and it appeared on the Taito Legends compilation. In some ways it feels like a Green Beret game, but it's more zoomed in with better graphics, and yeah, I really, really enjoy this game. It's a lot of fun and well worthy of your time. Okay, let's change gears now and switch to racing games. And of course, for the letter T, there's some really interesting ones. First of all, we have Turbo, released by Sega in 1981, and this was so important to the evolution of the history of racing games, with it giving that behind car view, admittedly from above slightly, and blistering fast scrolling action. Now another one that's interesting is Top Speed, released in 1987 by Taito. Now in many ways this is a trial run before the far more popular Chase HQ game, also made by the same designer, Hiroyuki Seiko. And you can see many of the graphical ideas and weather effects being showcased here first, with him taking all that inspiration to eventually do Chase HQ. Of course, the inspiration for this is more Outrun, but it's a racer that seldom talked about today, partly because it never ever saw a home release outside of the Sharp X68000, so it's not surprising it's being forgotten about today. Now another fun racer is of course Thrash Rally by Alpha Densi in 1991. It's an overhead rally game for the Neo Geo, and the game is a blast to play. It offers World Rally Championship, taking you all around the world, and the Paris to Dakar Rally version in the game as well. So there's lots of nice variety and varied levels for you to tackle and spend time with. Now another later game worthy of your time is Tokyo Cops Special Police Reinforcements. Now it's by Galeco and came out in 2003. And essentially this is Chase HQ, but on an open city map where you can go any direction to capture the enemy that you want. It's a really fun arcade race, and it will keep you coming back for more. Now sadly MAME isn't good at emulating this particular game, and it never ever saw a home release, but Technoparrot Emulator thankfully has this playable pretty well, so that you can experience this game today. Now let's go on to the shooter section with the letter T, and my word, there's some amazing blasters for this letter. So first of course we have the 1984 Konami sequel Time Pilot 84. This is set all in the future and unfortunately doesn't have the jumping ahead in time, which I think is a shame because it was such a wonderful thing of the original. And that's how I kind of feel with this game overall. It's just not a patch on that original game. You can tell that Yoshiki Okamoto had moved on and had nothing to do with this game. But you know, it's still, if you like your Time Pilot, it's clearly based on the same engine, so there's a lot to love here. Now moving on to horizontal shooters, and we can begin with Tengai, which is also known in Japan as Sengoku Blade. That's probably where most people know it. It's made by Saikyo and came out in 1996. You play heroes like a Buddhist warrior monk, and it's set in this wonderful steampunk feudal Japan setting. Now it had amazing Saturn port, and Arcade Archives on the Switch and PS4 does have a great version of this game to play today. Of course, as you're seeing here, MAME runs it perfectly well as well. Now one well regarded by many, but personally seems as pretty average to me, is Thundercross, released in 1988 by Konami. Now to me it's a no-frills horizontal shooter, and yeah, it's sort of middle of the road as far as I'm concerned, but there is a lot of love for this title, so maybe I'm missing out on something. Thankfully it is on the Konami Arcade Classic Anniversary Collection, which came out on all the modern consoles and PCs, so you can play this game relatively easily with that collection always being on sale digitally. Now sadly, the superior Thundercross 2, which came out in 1991 by Konami, is tougher to track down and play today. It never ever saw a home port or even an arcade release on any of the modern consoles. It didn't even come back in the day to any other region outside of Japan, so this will have passed many by, and it's a real shame as it is awesome. Thankfully Arcade Archives does have a version on the PS4 and Switch you can buy individually, and of course as you're seeing here, MAME runs it fantastically well as well. Now, one that is a huge disappointment, but I had to mention, is of course Thunder Force AC, the AC standing for arcade. This came out in 1990 by Technosoft, so the people who did the Mega Drive originals, and they essentially decided to do an arcade version of Thunder Force 3 on the Mega Drive, but bringing it to the arcade. And they added in some of the ideas and sections of Thunder Force 2, so it's sort of reworking of both of those games with the focus being on the third. So good so far, but unfortunately it's a really poor arcade port. They clearly understood the Mega Drive hardware far more than they understood the arcade hardware that this was running on, and it's such a shame, because I would love to have seen Technosoft do a version which used all the bells and whistles of the arcade to do a true enhanced version of their fantastic games of the Mega Drive. Much better though is the bizarre Three Wonders. Now it's also known as Wonders 3 by Capcom, and it's released in 1991. What you have here is three completely distinct separate games that you can play on the one cabinet, and they're three solid games really. There's Midnight Wanderers, Quest for the Chariot. So this is the first game of the three, and has you running as an elf, as a run and gun, shooting out the enemies to find the chariot. You play one or two elves, Lou and Siva, as you make your way through, and it's very cute and very reminiscent of, I don't know, Metal Slug and those sort of games. Now, the second game is kind of the sequel once you've got the chariot, and it's called Next is Chariot Adventure Through the Sky. This time you're in that chariot that you've found from the first one, and it's a horizontally scrolling shoot 'em up. You're still playing the same elves. It's great. It's a really solid horizontal shoot 'em up, well worthy of playing. And finally is a game that doesn't really relate to the others, bizarrely, and it's called Don't Pull, and it's basically a Pengo clone, so pushing blocks and getting the enemies. I've never got on with Pengo or its clones, so not one for me personally. Now these three games had a solid port on the Sega Saturn and PS1. It also appeared in Capcom Collection Volume 2 on the PS2 Xbox era, so no excuse of ways to legitimately play, but of course you can play it on MAME as you're seeing here. Now another nice shooter is Trouble Witches AC, released in 1996 by Siesta. There was also a Neo Geo version called Trouble Witches Neo. This is ultimately, it's a fun horizontal blast with gorgeous artwork and fast broom blasting action, and it's a worthy alternative to the more famous Cotton series. So if you like those and looking for something a bit different, this is well worthy of your time. Now today you can get the game on Steam or Switch, PS4, or emulates perfectly through Techno Parrot, as you can see. Right, okay, let's move on to some of the other vertical shooters for the letter T, and we come to the first Fab game, which is of course the brilliant Terra Cresta shooter. Now released in 1985 and developed by Mitsubishi, this is the sequel to the 1980 game Moon Cresta, which is also an awesome game to play. This, like its original, I mean it's now scrolling, but it's still a fun, solid shooter. And for the longest time this was number 5 on my top 5 list, before just being pushed off that 5th spot. Now Arcade Club has this game, and MAME runs it beautifully, as you see here, as well as Archives has it on the PS4 and Switch, so there's many ways to play it. Then we had a sequel to Terra Cresta with Terra Force, released in 1987, and also by Mitsubishi. This is actually the 4th in the series, with Dangar UFO Robo, yeah, that's going to appear in the next episode I'm pretty sure, being 3rd in the series. Now I love the Terra Cresta slower paced, more traditional shooter, and this, well, the entire series really is worth your time. Another great shooter is Tiger Heli, released in 1987 by Toplin and published by Taito. This is a great, if simple, vertical shooter by the genius who is Tatsuya Umera, who's behind most of Toplin's best games, and if you've watched this series of videos you probably heard his name come up quite a few times. But it was his development of this game of Tiger Heli, which was actually Cobra, it was its development name, so it will come up again there. But yeah, Cobra's brilliant. There's a nice simple shooter, and really, although early days, shows the wonder and skill of Toplin and also Tatsuya, so well worthy of your time. Yes, and as I mentioned, you know, whilst that development name was Cobra and it eventually was called Tiger Heli, he did do kind of a sequel with Twin Cobra, released in 1987. It's also made, as I say, by Tatsuya Umera, and it's known as Kyokoku Tiger in Japan, which is a real classic shooter, and I love Twin Cobra, well worthy of your time to give a go. Of course, such popularity made a sequel to Twin Cobra with Twin Cobra 2, released in 1995. This was also published by Taito, but it was actually developed not by Toplin, because they'd gone to the wall at this point. It was done by the Takumi Corporation, but the development house was basically Toplin employees, so it was as good as a Toplin game. This had a really good Sega Saturn port, and as you can see, MAME runs it perfectly. Now another interesting shooter and series is Thunder Dragon series, with the first one coming out in 1991. And these were developed by NMK, whom I consider as one of the most unappreciated shooting developers out there. No one ever seems to talk about them, and yet some of my favourite shooters are done by the NMK team. Now this has perfect bullet patterns and frantic gameplay, and it really does need to be played by more. I think it's a fantastic shooter. Likewise, in 1993, the sequel, Thunder Dragon 2, is also worthy of your time. Now it's also known as Big Bang Power Shooting, so you might have seen it in that name. But like the first one, this is a sublime shooter and needs to be played by more. Now a weird blaster you might want to try is Tenkomori Shooting, released in 1998 by Namco. It's a weird monkey-themed mini-game where you select random levels and all sort of shooty blaster action. Now it's not going to set the world ablaze, but it's a fun, weird, interesting game, and it's probably, you know, it's worth having a little go at next time you're perhaps looking through the list. It's one that no one ever talks about. Now there's an awesome Konami shooter series, of course, with Twinbee, and the first came out in 1985. This is a solid, if basic blaster, and it's well loved by many, and thankfully it's quite easy to play today because it is on the Konami Arcade Collection compilation, which is on all the modern consoles and often on sale. So, you know, that's a good way to sort of play it today. There was many sequels to Twinbee, but the one that I'm going to hone in on is the seventh and last in the series, which was Twinbee Yahoo. This is my personal favourite. It takes all that was great about the original Twinbee, but with sumptuous graphics and gorgeous, fun gameplay. It was released in 1995, and it saw a really solid Sega Saturn port, which is where I know it from, and it also came out on the PS1. Of course, today you can play it on MAME. Now, moving to run and guns, there is of course Total Carnage, released in 1992 by Midway. This twin stick shooter is a well-known blaster, really. Maybe it should have been on my big hitters, but I think it's more famous because it's a spiritual successor to the amazing game that is Smash TV. And compared to that game, this is a poor comparison. I've never really liked this game, even when it first came out. I think the graphics are ugly and it's got a somber colour palette. It just loses all the charm and fun of the original game, in my opinion. I know it has its fans out there. It did get home ports, but and maybe that's where people get some of the memories, but for me it was a huge disappointment. I would much rather have seen a proper sequel to a Smash TV, which I adore. Now, much better is Thunder Zone, released in 1991 by Data East, and this is a clone of Mercs, really. It's got a fantastic graphics and fun, all-out action gameplay. It's also known as Desert Assault. And I think the game needs to be played by more. I think it's not just a clone of Mercs. I think it does a better job in many ways. Maybe not as good as Sock Trooper, but still worthy of your time. Now onto light gun and vehicle shooters, and there is of course Namco's 2009 game Tank Tank Tank, with those exclamation marks, don't forget. And it's a blast to play this. You're basically in a tank up against giant monsters attacking cities. You're shooting other tanks as well as the monsters. It's got great multiplayer. The game is as addictive as hell. It's especially cool that every time you fire the gun, you feel the full recoil of that gun sort of judder the cabinet. Really, really good. And of course you see your picture that it takes of you as you play. Now sadly this game isn't emulated yet, so there's no really way that I'm aware of to play it in the home, but thankfully the cabinet is in Arcade Club in Bury on the Japanese floor, and it's so good. They've got a twin cabinet so you can play multiplayer. Unfortunately no more cabinets than that. But you honestly, it's one that may pass a lot of people by because they've never heard of it. But if you are in Arcade Club or you happen to see it in the wild, give it a go. You won't regret it. It's a fantastic game. Now another really fun light gun blaster is Sega's 2013 game shooter called Transformers Human Alliance. Of course it's based on the movies, or certainly the character designs are. And you get to work with the Optimus Prime and the Autobots to take out swathes of the evil Decepticon robots. I think that's generally the story. Now this is full-on, over-the-top action, worldwide locations. It's really good fun actually. I love playing it whenever I see it in the arcades. I think it's so much better than a lot of the other modern shooters out there. Now sadly there's no home port of this game, although Techno Parrot does emulate it perfectly as you see here, so well worthy of your time. But of course one Sega type gun shooter we had to mention with the letter T is using your keyboard as opposed to the gun, and is of course Sega's Typing of the Dead, released in 1999. It's part of the House of the Dead universe, but this time instead of shooting with your gun, you must type out words that are displayed quickly to destroy the enemies. So it's like Mavis Beavis teaches typing and House of the Dead. But it's a mad concept, and it really was at Sega at their weirdest and wonderful. And I miss those days of Sega. But yeah, no, it's surprisingly good. I mean, I bought a keyboard on my Dreamcast specifically for this game, and yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's more fun than you think it would be. So well worthy sort of tracking game today. Never seen it in the wild though. Right, on to the final section, and the last few games it will be on sport games. And what a great one to start with Table Tennis Championships, released in 1995 by Game Art. Now, this is a table tennis game, and it's really well done, addictive as hell to play. It's probably one of the best table tennis games I've personally come across, even better than the classic Konami table tennis game, or ping pong game. But yeah, I think it's well worth giving it a go. You'd really enjoy it if you like those sort of games. Now, another one that's a favourite with a lot of people is the Tekken World Cup. It's also known as the Tecmo World Cup as well. It's viewed from above, and interestingly, it uses a trackball to control your football players rather than a joystick. So it gives you a much more unique and more accurate passing and shooting, because obviously you can angle your shot more specifically. Now this is a real favourite with some of the RGDS hosts, King E and Garen being the two champions of this, and they always used to play it along with other players when we used to do trips to Arcade Club. However, sadly, the last few trips I've not seen it, so I don't know whether it's been put to one of the other sites, but it's a bit of a shame. Another football game is Taito Cup Finals. It came out in 1993. It's probably better known as Hat Trick Hero 93. I did cover it in the letter H. But yeah, I just can never mention it enough, really. It's a great arcade football game by Taito, and well worthy of your time. Even better is Taito Power Goal, which is actually Hat Trick Hero 95, alternative name. This improves on the series even more, and another huge favourite of mine. Now finally, for my honourable mentions, is the Title Fight by Sega. Now this is the sequel to their 1987 game, Heavyweight Champ. But this game came out in 1993, and it's Sega's answer to Nintendo Punch-Out, but it's, instead of using sort of like stereotypical characters and things, it uses more realistic opponents. But it's got great gameplay, and I love when you're knocked out and you see the blurry, sort of wavery guy counting you, the counting, giving you a good sense you've taken a few pounds to the head. Yeah, I think it's a great game and worthy of your time. Anyway, there you go. That was my top 5 and my many honourable mentions. Of course, I know there's even many more games than letter T, but of course I'm not there to cover every single game, just ones for me personally jump out at me or I think are interesting to give a shout out to. But let me know in the comments your personal top 5 for the letter T. What games do you think I missed out that you'd like to hear? Or what would your top 5 games be for the letter T? Because I'm sure they'll be different to my tastes, and I'll be interested to hear on either of those. Always good to hear from the listeners. So if you enjoyed the video, consider liking and commenting and reposting, as it'd be wonderful to hear your thoughts and help that YouTube algorithm in the sky to introduce these videos to more people. It's so difficult to get videos noticed these days. If you are watching it on my channel, The Drisk, don't forget there is the RGDS podcast, which I'm showing it in tandem, but so much more. The reason I've moved across to RGDS podcast YouTube, well, basically I've been doing RGDS podcast, the audio, for years and years. I've been a host on it for years and years, and great. Yeah, I'll put in the show notes if you want to listen to those. But recently we decided to do like a video version, just because we play the games anyway. Why not just sort of like stick the video to the audio track? But we do far more than that. I've been doing lots of other videos, gameplay footage, etc. And even better than that, and this is one of the reasons I like with the RGDS podcast YouTube as opposed to my own channel, is I love the fact that there's other people doing videos as well. Some of our audio listeners, podcast listeners, are taking the time to also upload their videos, which I think is really, really cool. And that's what I kind of like, is a collaboration. So please, consider subscribing to RGDS podcast. I'd love to hear you. Also consider joining our Discord channel. It's just a group where we all chat. I stress all of it's for free. We just do it as a hobby. We're not out to make money. In fact, we've switched off any sort of making money elements to the YouTube, just because that's not what we're about. We're about just the love of video games and sharing the passion with other people. So I hope you enjoyed, and look out for my next letter with the letter U. And I can't wait to go through these titles, and it will be nice to have a more focused, easier to cover letter with less games. Anyway, so until next time, keep it retro.